"He's mentally ill," my wife screamed at court, until the judge looked at her and asked, "Do you know?" 3 months later, they begged me to come back. I never intended for my life to become a spectacle whispered about in corridors and family group chats. But betrayal has a way of dragging you onto a stage you never auditioned for. For 10 years, I loved my wife, Mara. I trusted her enough to ignore the late-night messages, the sudden gym membership, the girls' trips that mysteriously never had photos. I trusted her until trust finally made a fool out of me. I found out the truth on a Wednesday, not through a dramatic confrontation, not through a confession, through a receipt. A tiny, stupid restaurant receipt from a place I'd never been, on a night she supposedly visited her sister. The signature at the bottom wasn't hers. It was her boss's. I didn't explode. I didn't scream. I didn't throw things. I just went quiet, too quiet. It scared her, but not enough to stop her. She spun lies so lazily that she didn't even bother making them believable. I packed my bags 2 days later. That was the moment she panicked. Not out of love, out of fear. She feared losing what she thought she controlled. But the real surprise wasn't her affair. It was what she did after. She filed a restraining order against me. She claimed I was unstable, mentally ill, emotionally unpredictable. She painted me as a danger to her safety, to everyone's safety, a threat. Her goal was simple: destroy me before anyone realized what she had done. The hearing day arrived. Her family sat behind her. Mine did too, watching, unsure, confused. Mara cried on cue, her voice trembling as she described me as someone I had never been. "He's mentally ill," she wailed. "He needs help. This order is the only way to keep me safe." The courtroom murmured. I stayed silent. Finally, the judge, a man who had seen lies in every shape, leaned forward and asked gently, "Mrs. Hale, do you know that your husband already submitted his psychiatric evaluation?" Her face froze. "And do you know," he continued, "that he passed every assessment? No signs of instability, no disorder, no risk factors." Her eyes darted around the room. "And do you know," the judge pressed, his voice suddenly sharp, "that you, on the other hand, are under investigation for falsifying a police report and presenting fabricated evidence?" Gasps filled the room. The judge turned to me. "Mr. Hale, you're free to go, and you may proceed with your counterclaim." I didn't smile. I didn't need to. My silence was enough. In the weeks that followed, her life collapsed. The affair became public, her boss was fired, she lost half her friends, and the restraining order ruling became a stain on her reputation. Meanwhile, I focused on myself. Therapy, not because I needed to prove anything, but because I wanted to clean the wounds she left. I started running. I reconnected with old friends. I rebuilt myself piece by piece. 3 months later, I heard a knock. I opened the door to find Mara and her mother on my porch. Her mother spoke first, tears in her eyes. "She's made a terrible mistake, we all have. Please, come back. She needs you. We need you." Mara's face was pale, desperate, exhausted. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I swear, I'll fix everything. Just give me one more chance." For the first time in months, I met her eyes fully. "You showed the court who you thought I was," I said quietly. "No, let me show you who I really am." Their expressions softened, mistaking my calm for forgiveness. I stepped back inside and closed the door. I didn't slam it. I didn't shout. Just a soft, final click. Because revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's simply walking away and making sure they know the door won't ever open again. He discovered his wife's affair on a Wednesday afternoon, but the story of that discovery didn't begin with fireworks or confrontation. It began quietly, like most betrayals do, with small, almost invisible cracks that only become obvious once everything finally collapses. For months, he had sensed something was off, but he had been too in love, too trusting, too willing to believe in the version of her he had built in his mind. Love, after all, has a way of blinding people to the truth, even when it's standing right in front of them, waving a red flag. Little moments had started stacking up. The sudden late nights at work. The new clothes she claimed were on sale, though the price tags told a different story. The gym membership she bought despite having always hated exercise. She started guarding her phone like it contained state secrets, turning it face down, setting new passwords, jumping whenever it pinged. Those weren't the signs he noticed at first, though. What he noticed was something subtler, something more painful. She had stopped laughing at his jokes. She had stopped reaching for his hand. She had started looking at him like he was a burden rather than a partner. But even then, he kept convincing himself it was just stress, just a rough patch, just life getting in the way. The truth didn't come crashing down on him. It arrived gently, tucked inside an ordinary slip of paper. He had gone to the car that Wednesday only to refill the windshield washer fluid. A simple task, something he had done 100 times. But while cleaning out the passenger side, he noticed a crumpled piece of paper shoved between the seat and the console. Thinking it was just trash, he picked it up and froze. It was a receipt from a restaurant he had never been to. The date and time were clear as day. It was the exact night she claimed she'd gone to her sister's house to help with the kids. At first, he told himself it meant nothing. Maybe she grabbed food with a friend. Maybe she stopped by on the way. Maybe the universe wasn't as cruel as the knot forming in his chest told him it was. But his eyes drifted to the bottom of the receipt, where a signature sat in black ink. Not hers. A man's name signed with a flourish, like he had every right to be there. Like he owned the moment. His breath left him in a slow, controlled exhale. Not anger, just understanding. A quiet, devastating clarity. Everything that hadn't made sense suddenly did. Every lie she brushed off. Every excuse. Every strangely distant expression when she looked at him, as if her heart was somewhere else entirely. He didn't storm into the house demanding answers. He didn't call her. He didn't cry. He simply sat in the car with the receipt in his hand, staring at it until the ink began to blur in his vision. There was pain, yes, but beneath the pain was something even colder, a sense of humiliation. He had loved her deeply, completely, foolishly, and she had repaid him by letting another man's handwriting slip into their life. That night when she got home, she acted so normal, kissing his cheek, asking about his day, laughing at something on her phone, that he felt sick. Not because she was a bad actress, but because she didn't even feel guilty enough to try harder. Betrayal wasn't just the cheating. It was the ease with which she pretended nothing had happened. He watched her move around the kitchen, watched her tie her hair up, watched her hum to herself while scrolling through her messages. All the while, the receipt burned like a brand in his pocket. He wanted to confront her right then. He wanted to ask who he was, how long it had been going on, whether she ever actually loved him. But he held back, not out of fear, but out of strategy. He wanted to hear her lies first, wanted to give her one last chance to be honest. Not because he believed she would be, but because he wanted to see how far she was willing to take the act. And so he asked casually, "How's your sister doing? The kid's still sick." She didn't even pause. "Oh, worse," she said instantly. "She barely slept that night. Thank God I was there." That was the moment the last remaining thread snapped. The ease with which she lied, not to protect him, not to spare feelings, but to protect her affair, cut deeper than the betrayal itself. He realized then that he had been living beside a stranger, not the woman he married, not the woman he once loved. A stranger who wore his wife's face, but none of her truth. For the rest of the night, he was silent. She didn't notice. She was too busy texting, smiling at a screen she guarded more fiercely than her vows. That smile, that glow, that hidden excitement, it wasn't for him. Hadn't been for a long time. He spent that night lying awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of their marriage. Every date, every fight, every promise, and every quiet warning he had ignored. He thought about the way she used to curl into him while sleeping. How she used to look at him like he was the safest place in the world. When had she stopped? And why hadn't he noticed sooner? But beneath the heartbreak, something else began to form, a seed of resolve, a stillness, a decision. He wouldn't explode. He wouldn't beg. He wouldn't fight for someone who had already chosen another man before even giving him the courtesy of truth. He would walk away with dignity intact, and he would let her destroy herself with her lies. The next morning, he packed a bag. She didn't wake up to see him leave. She didn't know that the quiet man she had walked over for months had finally reached his limit. That the strongest revenge wasn't rage, it was calm indifference. And so, the affair wasn't discovered with a bang. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It was a simple receipt, a tiny piece of paper that showed him everything he needed to know. Love hadn't blinded him. Trust had. And sometimes trust is the sharpest blade a person can be stabbed with. She filed the restraining order on a Monday morning, and in many ways that hurt him more than the affair itself. Betrayal in love is one thing, cruel, yes, but tragically common. But betrayal in character, Betrayal through lies designed to shatter a person's entire reputation, their dignity, their identity. That was a different level of cruelty entirely. What she did wasn't born from fear. It wasn't an act of protection. It was strategy, a calculated move to turn herself into the victim before the truth of her infidelity could catch up with her. She wasn't just trying to escape consequence. She was trying to bury him under it. The first sign something was wrong came when he heard a knock on his door. Two officers stood there, hands resting casually near their belts, their faces neutral but expectant. He felt a cold breeze move through his entire body before the words were even spoken. "Sir, we're here in response to a protective order filed against you." He blinked, confused. "Against me?" The officer pulled out a folded document and handed it to him. There it was, his name, his address, his wife's signature. A series of accusations so outrageous he almost laughed, until he realized this wasn't a sick joke. She had written that he was mentally unstable, that he had violent tendencies, that he had threatened her life, that she feared for her safety. Lies. Every word. His hands trembled not with rage, but with disbelief. This wasn't the same woman he had spent 10 years loving. This was someone else entirely, someone who, faced with the consequences of her affair, decided the easiest way out was to paint him as a dangerous man. He answered every question calmly, respectfully. The officers saw his shock, his confusion, his pain. They didn't treat him like a criminal, but the humiliation of standing on his own doorstep while neighbors peeked through blinds would forever be etched into his memory. Once they left, he sat on the couch and read the document over and over again. The words blurred, not because he couldn't read them, but because his brain refused to accept that she had gone this far. He knew marriages ended badly every day, but this felt personal, too personal. It felt like she was trying to erase him from the life they built together, rewrite their history, and cast herself in the role of the wounded wife. He replayed every fight they'd ever had, every disagreement, analyzing each moment for something that could justify her accusations. There was nothing. They had argued like normal couples, disagreed like normal couples, but he had never once raised a hand to her, never even raised his voice in a way that could be considered threatening. That wasn't who he was. But to her, he realized, the truth didn't matter anymore. The only thing that mattered was control. And she knew that society, the courts, the public, they tended to believe the tearful spouse, not the stunned one. The restraining order immediately changed everything. He had to leave their home, the home he paid for, the one he cared for, the one he had built piece by piece to make her happy. He packed what he could carry and stayed with a friend while his entire life was frozen in legal limbo. Friends called him. Some were shocked. Some were confused. Some didn't know what to believe. Even the slightest hint of doubt from people he loved cut him deeper than her betrayal ever had. She told her side to anyone who asked, and many who didn't. She claimed he was unwell, unpredictable, emotionally unstable. She layered her lies with dramatic pauses, trembling lips, and tearful glances down at her hands like she was recalling trauma instead of fabricating it. And people, not wanting to appear insensitive, sympathized. He watched his life unravel in slow motion. But what she didn't know was that he had already taken steps to protect himself. He had quietly scheduled a psychological evaluation before the hearing. He wasn't doing it to prove anything to her. He did it to prove to himself that he wasn't losing his mind, that the version of him she painted wasn't real. The evaluation came back spotless. No disorder, no instability, no red flags. The therapist even noted his calm demeanor, emotional maturity, and lack of aggression. The irony wasn't lost on him. The very traits that made him a gentle husband were the same traits she was trying to weaponize against him. The days leading up to the court hearing were some of the heaviest he had ever lived. Not because he feared losing, but because he feared that the woman he once loved was capable of destroying him with a smile. He replayed memories not to mourn the marriage, but to understand how someone could change so drastically. He remembered her laugh, her clingy hugs, the way she used to fall asleep on his chest, the way she once said he was her anchor. Was all of that a lie too? Or had she simply become someone else along the way? He remembered the nights she would rant about her coworker, ironically, the same man she was now sleeping with. She had built him up as an annoyance, a problem. Yet she was spending nights in restaurants with him, signing receipts together, building a secret life parallel to the one she pretended to share with her husband. Every lie she told to the world was crafted to make her affair look like a desperate escape instead of selfish betrayal. The morning of the hearing, he walked into the courtroom with quiet dignity. She walked in with a performance. Her makeup was minimal, her eyes watery, her voice soft and shaken. She held her mother's hand like a martyr marching toward her own suffering. She spoke with rehearsed fragility, describing him as a monster no one else had ever seen. She expected him to lose control, to snap, to prove her right. But he sat there silently, hands folded, expression calm, and that scared her more than any shouting ever could have. The moment the judge began asking questions, her confidence wavered. The more she talked, the more her lies tangled. She contradicted herself, added details she never mentioned before, exaggerated moments that didn't exist. The judge's expression shifted from sympathy to skepticism, and then came the moment that changed everything. The judge asked her, "Do you know your husband submitted a psychiatric evaluation?" Her face drained of color, because she had counted on one thing above all, that he wouldn't fight back, that he would crumble. But he didn't. She tried to swallow her panic, but it was too late. The courtroom now saw the truth, not because he exposed her, but because she exposed herself. And he realized something important in that moment. You don't need to raise your voice against a liar. You only need to remain quiet long enough for their lies to collapse around them. In court, she didn't walk in like someone seeking justice. She walked in like an actress stepping onto a stage. Everything about her was curated. The subtle smear of mascara under her eyes, the trembling hands, the carefully chosen dress that made her look fragile instead of fierce. She had practiced this performance in the mirror, he realized. She had rehearsed her lines, perfected her pauses, crafted her narrative. She was ready to portray herself as the broken wife of a dangerous man. And she thought everyone in that courtroom would eat it up. He sat quietly at the defendant's table, his hands folded, his face calm. If she expected him to look unstable or erratic, anything to match the story she'd told, she was going to be disappointed. He looked composed, patient, heartbreakingly dignified. That alone seemed to unsettle her. She stole glances at him again and again, as if waiting for him to crack, to snap, to scowl. But he didn't. His restraint frustrated her in a way no words could have. She took the stand with a shaky breath, clutching a tissue like it contained all her courage. Her voice quivered perfectly on cue as she recounted her version of their marriage. She painted a picture of a man who changed suddenly, a man who became unpredictable, a man who frightened her. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she spoke of sleepless nights, emotional wounds, and a terror that supposedly built inside her day by day. The judge listened quietly, offering no hint of opinion. But the spectators, the friends she had invited, her parents, a few co-workers, shook their heads in sympathy. Some even glared at him. Her story was convincing. She had always been good at manipulating emotion, twisting narratives, turning herself into a victim even when she was holding the knife. Every now and then she threw in a detail meant to deepen the illusions. He slammed the door so hard once, I thought it would break. He gets so quiet it scares me more than shouting. He looks at me like he hates me. Small, believable lies that made her sound vulnerable and him dangerous. She avoided saying anything too dramatic. She knew exaggeration would make her look suspicious. No, she stuck to the delicate range of emotional manipulation that relied on tone more than truth. When the judge asked for details, she hesitated just the right amount of time before answering, long enough to seem pained, but not long enough to seem dishonest. Every gesture was choreographed. She dabbed tears with gentle touches. She kept her voice just above a whisper. She occasionally glanced at him, shrinking back as though remembering trauma. But there was something she didn't understand. Real victims tremble with sincerity. Real fear doesn't need to be performed. And there was a hollowness in her eyes that only someone who had known her for years could catch. To strangers, she looked fragile. To him, she looked guilty. His lawyer asked simple questions when it was their turns. When did he threaten you? Where is the evidence? Did you file any previous reports? Did you tell anyone about these fears before your husband discovered your affair? Her answers grew shakier, not sorrowful shaky, but panic shaky. Like a liar trying to remember her script, her timeline began to break. Her explanations became inconsistent. She claimed she kept everything secret out of embarrassment, but moments later said she talked to a friend about it. She said he had episodes, but couldn't describe any. She mentioned he'd thrown something in anger, then admitted she couldn't remember when. The judge frowned slightly, a crack in her performance. Then came the moment that shifted the energy of the entire room. "Mrs. Hale," the judge said slowly, "do you know your husband submitted a psychiatric evaluation to the court?" Her head snapped up. Even from across the room, he saw it, the panic she tried to mask under a thin layer of confusion. She didn't know. She had assumed her accusations would stand unchallenged. She thought he would crumble, retreat, or walk in emotional ruins. The last thing she expected was for him to face her lies with irrefutable evidence. She attempted to regain composure. What evaluation? A full psychological assessment conducted by a licensed clinician, the judge replied. It shows no instability, no signs of aggression, and no mental health concerns. The room fell silent. Her mother's hand slid off her shoulder. One of her friends blinked, confused. His friend, sitting behind him, exhaled in relief. For the first time since entering the courtroom, she couldn't cry. She couldn't tremble. She couldn't act. She just sat there, frozen, her eyes darting left and right as if looking for an escape route. And, the judge continued, "It appears that some of the statements in your written testimony contradict what you've said here today." Her throat tightened. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. He didn't smile. He didn't smirk. He simply watched, feeling a painful mix of grief and clarity. This wasn't the woman he married. This was someone he never truly knew, someone willing to destroy him just to protect her reputation. The judge's questions became sharper, more direct. "You stated he threatened you verbally when you described unstable behavior. Can you provide specific events? You said he broke objects. Where is the photographic evidence?" With every question, she stumbled. Her confidence crumbled. Her voice cracked, not with sadness, but with fear of being exposed. Tears returned, but now they felt different. There was no sincerity, no vulnerability, only panic. The judge knew it. The courtroom felt it. Even her own mother's expression shifted from supportive to suspicious. Finally, the judge asked one final question. "Mrs. Hale, were you aware that the restraining order was filed shortly after your husband discovered your extramarital relationship?" A tremor went through the room. She inhaled sharply. I don't see how that's relevant." "It is extremely relevant," the judge replied, his tone firm. "It raises significant concern that this protective order was filed in retaliation rather than out of genuine fear." She went silent, completely silent. It was the moment her performance ended. Everyone saw her for what she was, not a victim, but a manipulator. Not a terrified wife, but a woman trying to bury her guilt under fabricated fear. The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable yet decisive. And he, sitting quietly at the defendant's table, felt a strange, bittersweet sense of closure. He had walked into that courtroom with nothing but truth and calmness. She had walked in with lies polished to perfection. But the truth didn't need theatrics. It didn't need tears or trembling hands. It just needed time. And when the time came, her entire performance collapsed under the weight of its own falsehood. When the judge exposed her lies, it didn't happen dramatically, with shouting or a gavel slammed in anger. It happened slowly, methodically, like someone peeling back layers of wallpaper to reveal mold underneath. It began with a simple shift in the judge's tone, a slight tightening, a heaviness that wasn't there before. She didn't notice it at first. She was too caught up in her performance, too confident that her tears and trembling voice were guiding the room exactly the way she intended. But he noticed it instantly. He saw the judge's eyes narrow, saw the pen pause mid-note, saw the subtle skepticism that replaced earlier neutrality. The judge began asking questions, not aggressive ones, not accusatory ones, just simple requests for clarification. But her answers didn't line up. One detail contradicted another. One claim was too dramatic to be believable. Another was so vague it sounded rehearsed. Her story began to develop holes so large they could no longer be ignored. "Mrs. Hale," the judge asked quietly, "you stated in your written report that your husband threatened you verbally on multiple occasions. Can you recall any specific instances?" She swallowed hard. I don't remember exact dates. Approximate ones." Then she shifted in her seat. "It was just many times, but none you can identify specifically." Silence. Her silence was louder than any accusation he could have thrown at her. The judge continued. You also mentioned property damage. You stated he broke objects during aggressive episodes. Do you have photographs? She glanced down. No. Did you report these incidents to anyone? Family? Friends? Law enforcement? Another pause. No, I was too embarrassed. The judge wrote something down, but his expression made one thing clear: embarrassment wasn't the issue here. Fabrication was. Her parents glanced at each other, the uncertainty beginning to creep onto their faces. They had believed her blindly. They had comforted her, defended her, stood by her. But now, watching her fumble through her lies, they looked shaken, not because of the possibility that she lied, but because of the realization that she was capable of it. Then came the moment that broke the illusion entirely. The judge looked up from the file in front of him. Mrs. Hala, were you aware that your husband voluntarily submitted a comprehensive psychological evaluation to this court? Her eyes widened, a small micro-expression, but big enough to expose her panic. She hadn't known. She had counted on her allegations being enough to paint him as unstable. She never imagined he would prepare actual evidence. I'm not sure what that has to do with. It has a great deal to do with this case. The judge interrupted calmly. Your primary claim is that your husband is mentally unstable and that this instability poses a danger to you. She inhaled shakily. Yes, because he's just unpredictable, and his evaluation shows no sign of instability, no violent tendencies, and no mental health concerns. The courtroom fell still. Her mother's hand slipped off her arm. One of her friends leaned back with wide eyes. Even the bailiff turned slightly, sensing the shift. The judge continued, this directly contradicts your accusations. For the first time, tears dried up on her face. Her performance couldn't continue. Not when the foundation she built it on had crumbled. She opened her mouth as if to protest, but the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, he said, flipping through his notes, there are discrepancies between your written statement and your verbal testimony today. Dates that don't match, details that shift, assertions that lack evidence. He paused, letting the silence fill the room before delivering the words that shattered her fragile act. It appears you may have falsified aspects of your report. A quiet gasp rippled across the courtroom. Her father looked at her with something between shock and disappointment, an expression she had probably never seen on him before. Her mother looked betrayed. Her friends stared at her as if she had turned into a stranger. And she looked utterly lost, caught in the web she spun for herself. The court, the judge said firmly, takes false allegations very seriously. He turned to the bailiff. Please note that we will be forwarding this matter for further review. She finally broke. No, please, Your Honor, he's lying. He's manipulating you. But her voice cracked with desperation, not fear. It was the voice of someone watching her version of reality collapse. Someone watching control slip through her fingers. The judge held up a hand. Mrs. Hale, if you interrupt again, I will remove you from this courtroom. Tears began streaming again, but they weren't the soft, carefully crafted ones from earlier. These were frantic, panicked, uncontrolled because they were real. Not from sorrow, but from fear of consequence. Meanwhile, he simply watched quietly. He wasn't triumphant. He wasn't smug. The victory felt heavy, bittersweet. He never wanted to see her destroyed. He only wanted the truth to stand where her lies had tried so hard to bury it. The judge turned to him. Mr. Hale, based on the evidence presented, you are free of all allegations. You may also proceed with your counterclaim if you wish. He nodded gently. Not out of joy, but out of relief. For the first time in weeks, he felt the weight on his chest loosen. The truth had spoken, and it had spoken loudly. As the hearing concluded, she reached out toward her parents, but they recoiled, not out of cruelty, but confusion. They no longer knew who she was. The courtroom slowly emptied, but she remained frozen in her seat, her world unraveling. He walked past her without anger or pride. Just quiet resolve. She whispered his name, almost pleading, but he didn't stop. Not because he wanted revenge, because he finally understood she didn't deserve a response. The judge's final words echoed in her mind and in the airs. This court does not tolerate deceit. But what hurt her most wasn't the legal consequence. It was that her lies, carefully constructed, emotionally manipulative, strategically timed, had failed. And they failed not because he fought back with equal cruelty, but because he fought back with calmness, truth, and dignity. In the end, her downfall wasn't his doing. It was her own lies collapsing under the weight of honesty she never expected him to have the strength to bring forward. After the court hearing ended and the truth finally stood clear, his entire life shifted in a way he hadn't anticipated. The victory hadn't filled him with triumph. It hadn't healed the wounds she inflicted. It hadn't erased the months of humiliation, fear, betrayal, and emotional exhaustion. What it did, however, was give him something he had forgotten he even deserved: peace. But peace didn't arrive the next morning like a gift dropped at his doorstep. It came slowly, quietly, and only after he made deliberate choices to rebuild the parts of himself that she had shattered. The first thing he did was take a long walk. Not to clear his head, there was too much in it for that, but to simply let his feet carry him somewhere that wasn't tied to her memory. He walked through a park he hadn't visited in years, feeling the breeze move across his skin like a reminder that the world hadn't ended just because his marriage had. Kids were playing, dogs were barking, people were laughing, living lives he had temporarily forgotten existed while he was trapped in the storm she created. He sat on a bench for nearly an hour, watching strangers exist without pain, and for the first time in months, he let himself breathe without forcing it. He realized something important then. Recovery wasn't going to happen to him by accident. He had to choose it, so he made small decisions, quiet ones, healing ones. He found a therapist not because he believed her lies about his mental health, but because betrayal leaves invisible wounds that don't heal on their own. He sat in the soft, lit office week after week, talking about things he had buried for years. His therapist didn't tell him what to think or how to feel. She simply gave him space to unravel safely. He learned that what he went through wasn't just heartbreak, it was emotional trauma, and it was okay to admit that. He also started taking care of himself physically. He returned to the gym, not to escape his thoughts but to burn through the heaviness lodged inside his chest. At first, he barely managed 20 minutes, but slowly, week by week, his strength returned. Muscles he neglected began to rebuild. His posture straightened, his sleep improved, and with each drop of sweat he felt pieces of himself returning. He reconnected with friends too, people he had unintentionally pushed away during the worst months of his marriage. He apologized not for what he had done, but for what he hadn't been able to do. Let them in. They didn't judge him. They welcomed him back with warmth, with laughter, with reminders that life still held joy even after betrayal tried to consume him. He also rebuilt his home, not the house he'd left behind, but a new space filled with things that reflected who he was rather than who she tried to make him be. He bought furniture he actually liked, not ones chosen to fit her aesthetic. He filled the fridge with foods he enjoyed. He kept his environment simple, peaceful, free of the tension that had once lingered in every corner of the old house. Then came silence. Not the painful silence of being ignored by the woman he loved, not the suffocating silence of feeling unworthy. This was a peaceful silence he created intentionally, a quiet that allowed him to hear himself again. For months, he focused on work, on personal goals, on relearning what it felt like to put himself first. He read books, something he had stopped doing because she always complained it, took attention away from her. He learned to cook meals he used to love. He took up running. He even tried painting once, not because he expected to be good, but because he wanted to feel what freedom tasted like. Slowly, steadily, his life began to bloom again. His nights no longer ended with dread. His mornings no longer began with anxiety. The ghost of her accusations no longer followed him. The judge had dismissed her lies. The world had seen her truth. And he no longer carried shame that wasn't his to bear. He became stronger, not in a hardened way, but in a gentle, unshakable way. He learned that strength wasn't raising your voice, it was raising your standards. It wasn't showing others you could fight, it was showing yourself you could rise. And rise he did. 3 months after the court hearing, he stood in front of the mirror and didn't see a broken man anymore. He saw someone who survived something people rarely speak about. He saw a man who had fallen apart privately, but rebuilt himself quietly, piece by piece, without needing anyone's permission to heal. He didn't hate her anymore. He didn't love her either. What he felt was something more powerful than both: indifference. She no longer had power over his emotions. She no longer lived in his mind. Her memory didn't burn, it barely flickered. She had taken enough from him already. She wouldn't get another ounce of his energy. In the process of rebuilding, he learned something else too. Self-respect isn't something someone gives you, it's something you reclaim. For so long, he had allowed himself to be gaslit into believing he was unworthy, unstable, or somehow responsible for her choices. Now he knew better. She cheated because she lacked discipline, honesty, and loyalty, not because he lacked value. She lied because deceit was easier than accountability, not because truth was too harsh. She manipulated because control made her feel powerful, not because he was weak. He stopped blaming himself for her actions. He stopped questioning whether he wasn't enough. He stopped apologizing for things he never did. And when he let go of that self-blame, something remarkable happened. His world expanded. The future no longer looked dark, it looked open. One afternoon, while drinking coffee alone on his balcony overlooking a quiet street, it hit him fully. He had survived her, and more importantly, he had survived himself during the worst version of himself that she had created. He smiled for the first time in a very long time, not the polite kind, not the forced kind. A real one, soft, peaceful, victorious in a quiet way. He wasn't the man she tried to destroy anymore. He was the man he rebuilt from the ruins she left behind. And that version of him, he wasn't going anywhere. 3 months had passed since the courtroom drama unfolded, and during that time, he had done something he hadn't realized he needed to do for years. He had reclaimed his life. The initial weeks after the hearing were not easy. In fact, they were some of the loneliest he had ever faced. The world outside his home seemed almost foreign. People he had once taken for granted now appeared distant. Friends and family who didn't know the truth hesitated to offer support, unsure how to react. But over time, he began to find the rhythm of life again, not as someone trying to survive, but as someone determined to thrive. The first step he took was learning how to be alone without feeling lonely. He filled his days with routines that grounded him, activities that reminded him that his life was his own. He spent hours reading, reflecting, and journaling, not to obsess over the past, but to understand himself. Writing his thoughts became a form of therapy, a way to untangle the years of confusion, heartbreak, and betrayal. Slowly, the raw edges of anger softened into clarity. He understood that the woman who had tried to destroy him wasn't capable of seeing him as he truly was, and that was not his failing, it was hers. Physical health became another cornerstone of his recovery. He began exercising daily, not to punish himself or compete with her, but to reclaim control over his own body. Early morning runs became a ritual. Each step pounding the pavement symbolized release of fear, of resentment, of the weight of months spent being unfairly accused. He felt the tension leave his shoulders and the heaviness in his chest lift. Strength came not just in muscles, but in the knowledge that he could endure, that he could rebuild his stamina, both physically and emotionally. He also reconnected with the people who mattered most, the friends and family he had allowed to drift away while trying to navigate the chaos of his marriage. Calls turned into visits, visits into shared meals, laughter, and the kind of conversations that reminded him who he had been before everything fell apart. Some relationships were strained at first, old hurts and misunderstandings resurfacing, but he approached them with patience. Slowly, trust was restored, not because it was easy, but because he made the conscious effort to repair what had been broken. These connections reminded him that life had meaning beyond the betrayal he had suffered. Rebuilding his personal space was another act of reclaiming his life. He moved into a smaller apartment at first, one that didn't carry the echoes of his failed marriage. Every item he purchased, every corner he decorated, reflected who he truly was, not who she wanted him to be. The home became a sanctuary, a place where he could feel safe, relaxed, and free from the emotional manipulation that had once controlled every aspect of his daily life. It wasn't lavish or extravagant. It was simple, warm, and filled with things that brought him comfort: books, plants, a comfortable chair by the window where he could watch the world without intrusion. During these months, he also cultivated silence, real silence, not the kind imposed by fear or loneliness. This silence allowed him to listen to his own thoughts, to recognize his own worth, and to find peace in the absence of conflict. In this quiet, he discovered strength he didn't know he possessed. He realized that revenge wasn't necessary because the universe had already corrected itself. Her lies had been exposed, her deceit revealed, and now he could walk forward without carrying the burden of anger or resentment. He understood that true power came not from confrontation, but from detachment. choosing peace over chaos, calm over rage, and dignity over destruction. Finally, the most profound realization came one afternoon as he stood by his window, looking at the sun dipping behind the horizon. She and her family had come, as expected, 3 months later, begging him to return, begging him to forgive, pleading with tears and desperation. But he did not move toward them. He did not yell, he did not cry, he did not respond with malice. Instead, he simply closed the door. The act wasn't loud or dramatic, but it carried more weight than any confrontation could. It was the final assertion of his independence, the ultimate boundary drawn between his past and his future. They had attempted to control him, manipulate him, and shame him, but he had risen above it all. By walking away, quietly, firmly, without needing to explain, he reclaimed not just his freedom, but his dignity. In these 3 months, he learned lessons that no court ruling could have taught him. Strength is not about proving others wrong. It is about proving to yourself that you are enough. Peace is not about forgetting betrayal. It is about refusing to let it define you. Independence is not about isolation. It is about reclaiming your life and your choices from those who sought to control them. And finally, revenge is not about retaliation. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply living well, silently, fully, and letting those who wronged you realize they cannot touch your spirit. By the end of those months, he was no longer the man she had tried to destroy. He was stronger, wiser, and more whole than he had been in years. The house, the routines, the friendships, the silence, and the simple act of walking away from her pleas all coalesced into a life rebuilt from pain into purpose. He had survived betrayal, exposed deceit, and reclaimed himself. And in doing so, he had become untouchable, not through anger, not through confrontation, but through resilience, patience, and self-respect.